For a long time, people argued about whether the center of human control was in the heart or in the head. And once they had localized the brain as the human control center, different theories about that arose. The psychologists that study the relationships between the brain and behavior are called physiological psychologists or biopsychologists or some variation of that. And three of the questions they ask are, number one, how does information from the environment get transformed into information that the brain can use? Number two, how do components of the nervous system transform this information into thoughts, feelings, and actions? And number three, how does the brain activate the body's muscles and glands in response to environmental conditions? And of course, there are many more questions that they ask than just these. I'm going to talk about some of the answers that we have so far. One of my professors in graduate school used to joke that he could never use a textbook for physiological psychology because there was always so much new information coming out that by the time the book was published, it was outdated. But we'll talk about what we know at this point. Our objectives for this chapter are, number one, to gain a general understanding of the nervous system. Number two, to gain knowledge of the structure and function of the neurons. And number three, to navigate your way around the major brain areas and understand their functions. The body's two most important communication networks are, number one, the nervous system, and number two, the endocrine system. We're going to talk about the nervous system first. It's very complex, it's very specialized, even more so than originally thought, and includes lots of different types of cells. The nervous system can be separated into the following divisions that you see illustrated on this slide. The nervous system has two main parts. One is the central nervous system, and the other is the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system controls all human behavior ultimately, from reflexes to reasoning. The peripheral nervous system conveys information from the body's sensory receptors to the central nervous system and the brain and back out again. The central nervous system is all the nerves in the brain and the spinal cord. It contains the majority of the body's neurons, and we're going to talk about it in detail later. What we'll talk about first is the peripheral nervous system, which again carries messages to and from the central nervous system. It has two different divisions. One is the somatic nervous system, and the other is the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system acts in relation to the external world. In other words, it controls the skeletal muscles. So any voluntary motion that you engage in, moving arms, moving legs, is controlled by the somatic division of this peripheral nervous system. The autonomic nervous system you can think of as being kind of automatic. It controls the involuntary body functions. Now, I say involuntary with one sort of main exception, which is that there are techniques you can use to control some of these functions. Things like progressive relaxation and biofeedback allow people to control some of the generally involuntary body functions like heart rate and pulse. In general, though, it regulates the internal world. It controls your visceral muscles and glands. The autonomic system contains nerves running to and from internal organs that regulate things like respiration, heart rate, and digestion. Also hormone secretion, and plays a role in emotions. It controls basically internal biological functions. It also controls things like the heart, constriction of blood vessels, and the lining of the stomach and the intestines. Now, the autonomic nervous system has two main divisions itself. And aren't you glad you have a little map or diagram up here to lead you through this, because it gets a little complicated. But one of the divisions is called the sympathetic division, and you can think of that as being sympathetic to your current situation. So if you're frightened, it reacts and helps you, fight off your attacker. When you're anxious, it activates the parts of your brain that need to be alert and attentive in an anxious situation. So it's right there with you, preparing you for whatever comes at you. Messages here originate in the thoracic and the lumbar portions of the spine, between the neck and the lower spine. And during emotional excitement, the sympathetic division does things like speed up the heart, dilate the arteries of the skeletal muscles and heart, constrict the arteries of the skin and digestive organs. And the point of both of those is to get you to stop digesting so you can use all your energy to run or fight or whatever you need to do to address the concern. And if you're going to run and fight, you certainly don't want anything in your stomach, which is why sometimes when people are frightened, throw up. The body's just getting rid of things it doesn't need at the moment so it can do its job and protect you. And the other thing it does is it causes a secretion of hormones leading to emotional arousal. So it activates your emotions. The other division is the parasympathetic nervous system, and it calms the body down to conserve energy and maintain energy. If you were to stay activated and fearful and anxious or overly attentive and vigilant at all times, you would burn out. You would get very sick. And in fact, people who are subjected to long-term stressors tend to have problems with their immune function. In other words, when you're under stress for prolonged periods of time, your body gets weakened and exhausted and burned out and is more vulnerable to the flu and colds and other illnesses that come along. So you need some part of your body that's going to calm you back down, allow you to relax and conserve your energy and protect your immune system so you don't get burned out and exhausted. The parasympathetic division messages originate in both the cranial region above the neck and the sacral region at the base of the spine. If the sympathetic division is thought of as dominant during violent or excited activity, the parasympathetic may be thought of as dominant during inactivity. Once the threat has passed, gets your stomach digesting again. It conserves body resources. And the two of them interact in an adaptive manner optimally. Whenever the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers are connected to the same muscle or gland, they usually act in opposite ways. So the sympathetic system speeds up your heart, and the parasympathetic system allows it to slow down and rest. The sympathetic inhibits digestive processes, and the parasympathetic gets them started again once the threat is passed. So the systems take turns dominating depending on which is more adaptive. If you need to run and fight, or if you need to relax, conserve energy, and in fact re-energize yourself by feeding and drinking and relaxing and sleeping. The other thing that the somatic system does is it transmits information about external stimulation from the skin, muscles, and joints to the central nervous system. So it makes it possible to feel things like pain, pressure, temperature, textures, and then that information is passed along to the central nervous system. The brain represents about 2% of your body weight and uses about 20% of the resources from your body. And it's just composed of bunches and bunches of neurons which form nerves. The spinal cord is a complex tangle of nerves that stretch from the brain to the tailbone. And its role is to collect and transmit information between the brain and spine and peripheral nervous system. So the spinal cord contains all the nerve fibers running to and from the brain to the various parts of the body. And it's protected by a bony spinal vertebrae, which is why if you break your back, that makes it vulnerable, and then that's when you have problems with paralysis. The other thing that the spinal cord does is it initiates reflexes, speaking of paralysis, which are automatic responses to an event. Now, sometimes the body, arm, leg, feels something or has something happen to it that requires an immediate response. In other words, you want to get that body part either away from that object or have some sort of response before damage is done. And what has evolved as a really quick, effective way to do this is to have some messages processed by the spinal cord. So the message, let's say there's a sharp spike. Your finger lands on that sharp spike, and that message rushes up your nerves to the spinal cord and then also up to the brain. But it actually may get processed at the spinal cord so that the body can send a message out very quickly to get that hand away from that sharp object. So the reflex can be processed right at the spinal cord if it's very basic. And then the message also travels up to the brain, but that takes just a little bit longer. And we're talking very short amounts of time, but time is of the essence when there's some sort of harm that's threatening the body. What's interesting about the issue of reflexes is that sometimes when someone's spinal cord is damaged such that afferent messages about pain and messages going out about trying to move body parts don't get through because of the severed spinal cord, the reflexes will still be there. So the person may not feel the sharp object or the flame or something like that their leg or arm is coming into contact with because their spinal cord is severed and they're paralyzed. But because that reflex is processed at the spinal cord, they will pull their arm or leg away. So oftentimes spinal cord injuries don't affect reflexes because reflexes are processed much more immediately, and the message doesn't necessarily have to reach the brain for us to respond to stimuli. So again, the peripheral nervous system links the central nervous system to the organs, muscles, and glands of the body. The peripheral system has two main parts, actually 4 parts in all, as I mentioned before. The first major dichotomy is of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, as we've already discussed. And again, to review, the somatic nervous system controls voluntary muscle movements, so it controls your hand as it writes, your feet as you tap them or as you walk, and any other muscles that you're moving. The autonomic system controls your glands, organs, and blood vessels, things that you have to be specially trained to have any influence over, because usually they're automatic. It too has 2 parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. And the sympathetic system is what reacts to dangerous stimuli, prepares you for fight or flight when you are feeling threatened. And typically it involves having your heart race, maybe some sweating, slowing your digestion, maybe making you pee, dilating your arteries, and increase, again, in sweat to cool you off, and theoretically to give your hands a little bit more traction when you go to grab onto something. Conversely, the parasympathetic slows you down so that you can rest, conserve energy, and recharge. So it produces the opposite effect. It slows your heart, allows your digestion to resume, constricts your arteries, slows your breathing rate. And so once you come down from the threat, it allows you to relax so you don't stay perpetually activated, which would, again, burn you out, make you more vulnerable to illness. And on this slide, you have a little illustration of all the different things that the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system have an effect on.
This slide shows some other examples of the differences between how the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division of the nervous system respond to stress and calm. And it breaks it down by eyes, salivation, skin, respiration, heart, digestion, and adrenal glands. And gives you an example for each one.
Okay then, all brain activity originates with the neuron. These are basically the messages of the brain world, and they receive signals from other neurons or sense organs, process the signals, and send them to other neurons, muscles, and organs. And there are 3 main types of neuron. There are the sensory neurons, which are sometimes called afferent neurons, that carry information from the sense organs to the brain and spinal cord. In other words, they respond to sensory organ input. And there are the motor neurons, sometimes called efferent neurons, that carry signals from the brain and spinal cord out to the muscles and glands. In other words, they send signals to muscles to control movement. And the messages, of course, come from the brain and spinal cord. There are also interneurons, which are the go-between of sensory and motor neurons. And in other words, they connect neurons to other neurons and integrate the activities of the sensory and motor neurons. relationships between interneurons somehow get translated into what we call thoughts, feelings, and perception. For every motor neuron, there are approximately 4,000 interneurons. So there are more interneurons than any other type of neuron. Also importantly, there are cells that support the neurons, and these are called glia. They're a different type of cell in the nervous system, and they are 10 times more numerous than neurons. Glia means glue, and what they do is they surround the neurons and hold them in place. And they carry nutrients to the neurons, remove waste, protect the neurons from substances in the bloodstream, and also play a role in propagating impulses. They're very important to the neuron's survival. Overall, we have about 100 billion neurons. And what's fascinating is that most, but not all, can be regrown. There are some cases of severe spinal cord injury where people never recover completely, although even now there are new technologies being developed such that more growth can be encouraged and supported. But on the other hand, if you cut your finger, those nerve cells that are damaged in that process quickly recover and regrow. Reflexors are an important phenomena. In some cases, neurons in the spinal cord, as I mentioned before, process important information such as pain on their own before the brain does. And they can get a message out to the limb much more quickly regarding how to respond, which can reduce damage inflicted on the limb. And then in the next clip I have here, will show you this. If the clip doesn't work within this lecture, I've also included it as one of the links on one of the handouts for this learning module.